are foundational to the United Nations. The contributions to UN peacekeeping forces are unmatched and irreplaceable, and their commitment to multilateral solutions is an antidote to our ailing world. Across the globe, democracy is eroding, populism and extremism are increasing, our climate is heating, and trust in institutions of all kinds is breaking down. The global economy is faltering, and many developing countries are caught in the jaws of a debt crisis, unable to pay their bills or to invest in sustainable development, climate action, or digital technologies. The share of official development assistance going to Africa is at its lowest level in more than 2 decades. And high interest rates put private finance largely out of reach of so many countries. Meanwhile, conflicts are multiplying and human rights and international law are being flouted, from Russia's invasion to the Ukraine, to Sudan, and to the Middle East. The relentless Israeli bombardment of Gaza in response to the horrific terror attacks by Hamas is the most intensely destructive campaign waged since I became Secretary General. The number of civilian casualties, including women, children, and our own staff, is unprecedented in such a brief period of time. It continues to rise, and hunger and disease are now adding to the toll. More than 100 days after 7 October, more than 100 hostages are still being held, and they must be released immediately and unconditionally. And I will not give up on calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. That is the only way to end this nightmare for civilians in Gaza, facilitate the release of all hostages, and prevent the conflict from engulfing the entire region. The refusal to accept the two-state solution for Israel and Palestinians and the denial of the right to statehood to the Palestinian people are unacceptable. This would indefinitely prolong a conflict that has become a major threat to global peace and security, exacerbate polarization, and embolden extremists everywhere. The right of the Palestinian people to build their own state must be recognized by all. Ladies and gentlemen of the press, my messages to the non-aligned movement and the G77 plus China focused on renewed international efforts for peace, financing for sustainable development and climate action, and the need for urgent reforms to our multilateral institutions. From the United Nations Security Council to the Bretton Woods system, global institutions reflect the world that built them 80 years ago when many African countries were still colonized. They are no longer fit for purpose. Security Council is stuck in a time warp. How can we accept that it still lacks a single African permanent member? The global financial system is outdated, dysfunctional, and unfair. This September, the United Nations will convene the Summit of the Future with a focus on updating these institutions so that they align with today's world and respond to today's challenges, notably to the vital interests of developing countries. Governments will also consider our proposed new agenda for peace, which sets out initiatives around disarmament, conflict prevention, tackling terrorism and transnational crime, and managing the security threats, including those posed by artificial intelligence. The new agenda for peace calls for a new generation of peace operations, including peace enforcement and counter-terrorism operations, led by regional partners, notably the African Union, but with a Security Council mandate and supported by guaranteed funding, including through UN-assessed contributions. I've been urging this for many years, and I welcome the Security Council's recent resolution in support. As a matter of fact, it does make sense to have peacekeeping operations where there is no peace to keep. We need peace-enforcing operations, African peace-enforcing operations, but properly supported by the international community. Ladies and gentlemen of the press, peace and sustainable development go hand in hand. Developing countries have a large and growing share of the global economy, but their representation in global financial institutions lags far behind. September Summit of the Future will consider ways to reform the global financial architecture and make it truly universal and responsive to today's global challenges. In the immediate term, we need urgent action on debt, including a reprieve for countries facing unsurmountable debt repayment obligations over the next 3 years. And we also need faster progress on an SDG stimulus of $500 billion a year in accessible long-term finance for sustainable development. Multilateral development banks must be adequately capitalized and must change their business models to leverage far more private finance for developing countries at reasonable cost to invest in the SDGs. And developed countries must meet their pledges on climate finance. Clarifying the delivery of the $100 billion and doubling adaptation finance are an essential starting point for much greater ambition. The unity and tenacity of the Global South helped to create the Loss and Damage Fund, but it now needs significant contributions to fulfill its purpose. Ladies and gentlemen, the United Nations is working around the world to support the efforts of developing countries to mobilize domestic resources and maximize investments in the SDGs. Strong, cohesive societies can only be built on a foundation of advancing sustainable development, respecting human rights, and recognizing the rights of minorities and standing up to all forms of discrimination. It is critical to uphold the basic human rights of every person, regardless of background, race, religion, sexual orientation, or political opinion. Here in Kampala, governments from the Global South have stressed the importance of multilateral solutions based on global justice and international law. Their strong voices will resonate across the year of global reforms. This is the only path to a safer, fairer, more peaceful world for all, and I thank you.
Thank you so much. We're going to take a couple of questions. We'll start with Uganda Broadcasting Corporation, Mr. Timothy.
Good morning, Mr. Secretary General. My name is Timothy from UBC. The question is the big divide between the Global North and the Global South. How do you plan to bridge that gap, especially leveraging on a youthful population in Africa? Thank you very much.
Well, one thing is clear. The institutions that today are relevant for development, for climate action, the international financial institutions were created after the Second World War. When they were created, very few African countries existed as independent countries. And so they reflect the world of the post-Second World War instead of reflecting the world of today. That means that the Global South is in a position of clear inferiority because it lacks an effective representation in those institutions. The Security Council, the Bretton Woods institutions. And because of that, obviously those institutions have been more attentive to the needs of the Global North than to the needs of the Global South. And there is an increase of inequality that needs to be quickly corrected. That is why we have been asking for the reform of the institutions, to make them exactly adapted to the reality of today's economy, for an adequate representation, namely Africa, and at the same time for a set of measures in relation to debt relief, in relation to the SDRs, the special drawing rights redistribution, in relation to the change of the business model and the capitalization of multilateral development banks, in order to mobilize much more resources for the African countries to be able to address the enormous challenges that